Gideon dropped his leather briefcase onto the cold marble floor of the grand entrance. The heavy sound echoed through the high stone arches of his estate in Asheville, North Carolina, but nobody came to greet him. For 7 whole days, the entire household had been trapped in a nightmare of endless crying. His newborn son, Leo, had not slept, and the sound was wearing away at everyone's sanity. Gideon ran a pale hand through his stark white hair, feeling the heavy exhaustion of a long journey that had yielded no answers. He had consulted the oldest vampire healers and the most expensive human pediatricians across the country, yet none of them could find a way to soothe the infant. The air inside the mansion felt thick and stagnant, filled with the tension of a week without peace. He walked down the long, dimly lit corridor toward the nursery, expecting to hear the usual piercing screams that had torn through the halls for a week. Instead, he noticed a strange, unfamiliar quiet settling over the eastern wing of the house. Gideon slowed his steps, his boots making no sound on the thick rugs, as he approached the open doorway. Inside the room, a woman was sitting on the wooden rocking chair near the window, bathed in the soft gray light of the late afternoon. It was Maid, the human worker he had hired 3 weeks ago, simply to dust the furniture and clean the upper floors. She was gently swaying back and forth, holding the tiny baby against her chest with a steady, rhythmic motion that looked completely natural. Gideon stood frozen at the entrance, his fingers tightly gripping the cold brass handle of the door as he watched the scene unfold before him. For the first time since the child was born, Leo was breathing quietly, his tiny chest rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. The fierce red flush had left the baby's cheeks, replaced by the soft, healthy color of a deep and undisturbed sleep. Gideon felt a sudden, unfamiliar warmth loosen the tight knot of tension in his chest, a feeling he did not quite know how to name after decades of cold routine. This human woman, who usually moved silently through his home with a mop and a bucket, was holding the royal vampire air as if she knew his every need. He cleared his throat softly, careful not to break the fragile silence that had finally settled over the room after so many days of torment. Maeve did not startle or pull away. She simply turned her head toward him, her calm brown eyes meeting his gaze with a steady, unblinking directness. Gideon stepped inside, the pale light catching the sharp angles of his face and the unusual white of his hair, which often intimidated ordinary humans. He kept his voice low, almost a whisper, asking how she had managed to achieve what so many highly paid experts could not even begin to handle. Maeve gave a small, careful nod, her hands never stopping their gentle, comforting motion against the infant's back. She explained that she had simply heard the baby crying from the end of the hallway while she was washing the windows, and could not bear to leave him alone. She told Gideon that she had walked into the nursery, lifted the child into her arms, and began to sing an old simple melody her grandmother used to use in the countryside. Within 5 minutes, the baby's frantic movements had slowed, his tiny fingers latching tightly onto the blue fabric of her cotton work shirt as he fell asleep. Gideon took 2 steps closer, staring down at his son's relaxed face and the way the boy seemed to trust this stranger completely. He felt a mixture of deep gratitude and slight embarrassment that his wealth had failed where simple human kindness succeeded. Gideon leaned against the edge of the dark wooden table, his pale eyes remaining fixed on the quiet pair by the window as he asked her if she had children of her own. Maeve looked down at the sleeping boy in her lap, her expression softening into a look of quiet longing that spoke louder than any words. She told him about her daughter, Lily, who was currently living with her grandmother in a small rural town 300 kilometers away, while Maeve worked in the city. She admitted that she only got to see her daughter twice a month because the train tickets were expensive, and her working hours left her very little free time. Gideon listened closely, realizing for the first time that this quiet woman carried a heavy burden of her own every single day. He realized how little he knew about the people who kept his massive estate running, always viewing them as distant figures who existed only to maintain the property. The expensive paintings on the walls and the imported furniture suddenly felt cold and meaningless compared to the genuine warmth Maeve brought into the nursery. He asked her how long she had been living away from her daughter, and she replied that it had been nearly 2 whole years of constant separation. She explained that Lily still cried every time she had to board the bus to return to Asheville, a sound that broke her heart every single month. Gideon closed his eyes for a brief second, trying to comprehend that kind of human sacrifice, finding himself deeply moved by her honesty. He looked back at her hands, noticing how gently her fingers stroked the baby's fine hair, ensuring the blanket stayed tucked securely around his small shoulders. Gideon took a deep breath, his mind made up as he looked straight into her eyes and offered her a completely different position in his home. He told her he wanted her to leave her cleaning duties behind and become Leo's full-time nanny, promising to double her current salary immediately. He added that she would have every single weekend off so she could travel back to see her daughter without worrying about the cost of the train tickets. Maeve stared at him in complete silence, her eyes widening as she tried to process the unexpected offer. Before she could answer, the soft sound of footsteps echoed from the wooden floorboards of the hallway outside the nursery door. Vivian, Gideon's elegant vampire companion who helped manage the social duties of the estate, walked into the room with a pale, exhausted face and dark circles under her eyes. She stopped dead in her tracks, her gaze shifting rapidly from Gideon to Maeve, and then finally to the sleeping baby resting peacefully in the rocking chair. Vivian let out a long, trembling breath, shoulders losing the rigid tension they had carried for the past 7 days. She whispered that she could not believe the child was finally quiet, asking if the nightmare was truly over. Gideon walked over to Vivian, placing a steady hand on her shoulder to comfort her, confirming that Maeve had managed to soothe the boy within 5 minutes of holding him. Vivian looked at Maeve with a deep sense of relief, her usual aristocratic reservation melting away into pure, honest gratitude as she thanked her. Maeve offered a polite, humble smile, explaining that she only did what any mother would do when hearing a child in distress. Vivian turned to Gideon, giving a quiet nod of approval when he explained the new arrangement he had just proposed to the human worker. Together they stood in the quiet nursery, feeling the first real shift toward peace that the old estate had experienced in a very long time. The next morning, the grand estate felt entirely different, as the bright sun filtered through the tall glass windows, warming the usually cold stone floors. Gideon sat behind his large oak desk in the study, watching the morning mist slowly lift from the surrounding mountains of Asheville. He had spent the night thinking about the strange magnetic pull he felt toward Maeve, a gentle warmth that seemed to cut right through his cold vampire nature. For hundreds of years, he had lived a life dictated by duty, bloodlines, and old traditions, rarely interacting with humans on a personal level. Yet the simple sight of Maeve holding his son had awakened a quiet curiosity in his chest that he could not easily dismiss. A soft knock sounded on the heavy wooden door, and Maeve entered the study, holding a small tray with a cup of black coffee. She had already changed out of her old cleaning uniform into a simple, neat sweater and trousers, looking calm despite the grandeur of the room. Gideon thanked her and signaled for her to sit down in the armchair across from his desk, wanting to finalize the details of her new role. He looked at her closely, noting the pale sunlight highlighting the natural warmth of her skin, creating a striking contrast to his own bloodless complexion. He told her that her new duties would begin today, and that her only responsibility was the well-being and happiness of little Leo. Maeve adjusted her position in the chair, her fingers intertwining in her lap as she looked at Gideon with a mixture of hope and lingering doubt. She admitted that she was deeply grateful for the generous salary, but she needed to ask for one specific condition before she could fully accept. She explained that she could not bear the thought of being completely separated from her daughter Lily for weeks at a time, even with the weekends off. She asked if it would be permissible for Lily to visit the estate once every month, just so the young girl could see where her mother worked and know she was safe. Maeve's voice trembled slightly, revealing the deep maternal ache she had carried alone for 2 years. Gideon did not hesitate for a single second, his heart responding to her request before his analytical mind could even form a reply. He told her that the estate was far too large for just 3 people, and that there was more than enough space in the eastern wing of the house. He suggested that instead of a monthly visit, Maeve should bring Lily to live at the mansion permanently, offering them a large private suite on the 2nd floor. He explained that a child's laughter would bring life to the silent hallways, and it made no sense for them to live apart when they could be together. Maeve stared at him, her lips parting in utter disbelief as a single tear escaped her eye. She quickly wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, her face lighting up with a radiant, genuine smile that Gideon found incredibly captivating. She thanked him repeatedly, her voice thick with emotion, as she explained how much this meant to her and how it would completely change their lives. Gideon felt a strange, pleasant fluttering in his chest, an emotional response he had long forgotten existed within his immortal frame. He realized that helping this human woman gave him a sense of purpose that his royal titles and vast wealth never could. He stood up from his desk, extending his pale hand to seal the agreement, and felt the warm, soft touch of her skin against his cold fingers. Later that afternoon, Vivian joined them in the sunlit garden, carrying Leo in a woven basket, while the baby napped peacefully under the shade of an old oak tree. Vivian watched Maeve arrange the soft blankets, her movements precise yet incredibly gentle, ensuring the infant was perfectly comfortable in the fresh mountain air. Vivian turned to Gideon, expressing how remarkable it was to see the baby so calm after a week of pure exhaustion. She admitted that she had been terrified. Something was seriously wrong with the boy, something that their traditional vampire remedies could not fix. She confessed that Maeve's presence felt like a quiet blessing that had arrived exactly when the household needed it most. Maeve looked up from the basket, offering a warm, reassuring smile to Vivian, telling her that every child simply required a different way of being understood. She explained that infants could feel the tension and fear of the adults around them, which often made their crying even worse. She assured Vivian that Leo was perfectly healthy and just needed to feel a steady, calm heartbeat to ground him in his new surroundings. Vivian listened intently, her aristocratic posture relaxing as she accepted the wisdom of the human mother, realizing that specialized diplomas could never replace true maternal instinct. The two women shared a quiet moment of mutual respect, breaking down the old barriers between their two distinct worlds. As the sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, casting long golden shadows across the green lawn, Gideon watched Maeve walk back toward the house. Her simple presence had already begun to alter the cold, sterile atmosphere of the grand estate, introducing a quiet harmony that felt deeply healing. He found himself looking forward to the days ahead, eager to see how the mansion would change once Maeve's daughter arrived to fill the empty rooms. He knew his extended vampire family would not understand his decisions, but as he looked at his sleeping son, he felt entirely secure in his choice. The old walls of the Asheville estate were finally beginning to feel like a home, anchored by the quiet strength of a human woman. The peace of the household was abruptly interrupted on Thursday afternoon when a sleek, dark car pulled up the long gravel driveway without any warning. Gideon stood at the top of the stone staircase as his mother, Eleanor, stepped out of the vehicle, her elegant black coat flowing around her strict, regal figure. Eleanor was a high-ranking noble within the Vampire Society, known for her adherence to old traditions and her deep disdain for human involvement in royal affairs. Her sharp, pale face was set in a mask of pure disapproval as she marched into the grand entrance, her cold eyes scanning the room. She demanded to speak with Gideon immediately, her voice echoing sharply against the high marble walls. Gideon led his mother into the formal drawing room, closing the heavy doors to ensure their conversation would not disturb the rest of the house. Eleanor did not waste a single moment, turning to her son with a look of utter horror and demanding to know why a human cleaner was caring for the royal heir. She argued that the family's reputation would be completely ruined if the High Council discovered that a common worker was performing such duties. She insisted that Gideon should have hired a certified vampire nurse with proper noble references, rather than trusting an ordinary human who had appeared out of nowhere. Her words were sharp, filled with the old prejudices of their immortal kind. Gideon remained perfectly calm, his white hair contrasting sharply with his dark suit, as he looked directly into his mother's furious eyes. He told her firmly that the expensive specialist she insisted on had failed completely for 7 long days, leaving the child weak and exhausted. He explained that Maeve was the only person who possessed the true capability to soothe Leo, doing so within 5 minutes of holding him in her arms. He stated that he cared nothing for the gossip of the High Council or the opinions of distant relatives, as his only priority was the health of his son. His voice was quiet, but carried the absolute authority of a vampire king, leaving no room for further argument. Eleanor crossed her arms, her expression remaining bitter, as she warned him that he was making a dangerous mistake by allowing humans too close to their royal bloodline. She claimed that people would say he was incapable of managing his own estate, and that Vivian should be handling the child according to their traditional ways. Gideon simply shook his head, telling his mother that he would no longer allow old, rigid rules to dictate the happiness of his family. He turned away from her, effectively ending the conversation, and walked out of the drawing room, leaving his mother standing alone in her indignation. He headed straight up the stairs, feeling a strong desire to return to the warmth of the nursery. When he entered the upper hallway, he saw Maeve walking down the stairs, holding the hand of a little girl with large, curious eyes and soft brown curls. It was Lily, who had arrived at the estate earlier that morning to begin her new life with her mother in Asheville. The young girl gripped her mother's skirt tightly, looking around the massive hallway with a mixture of awe and gentle fear. Gideon knelt down to her eye level, softening his sharp features and offering the most gentle smile he could manage to reassure the child. He welcomed Lily to her new home, telling her she could play, run, and explore whenever she wished. Lily looked up at her mother, seeking confirmation, and Maeve gave a reassuring nod, her eyes shining with a deep, silent gratitude that touched Gideon's heart. The little girl finally relaxed, offering Gideon a shy, beautiful smile that seemed to instantly brighten the dim corridor. Gideon stood up and turned to Maeve, reiterating that the large suite at the end of the hall was entirely theirs to decorate and use as they pleased. He watched Maeve lead her daughter toward their new quarters, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that he had brought them together. He knew the path ahead would challenge his family's traditions, but the genuine happiness in Maeve's eyes made every difficulty completely worthwhile. Later that evening, after Eleanor had left the estate in a quiet fury, Gideon found Vivian sitting on the edge of the master bed, watching the moon rise over the mountains. She looked up at him, her eyes soft, as she admitted she had heard the argument downstairs and wanted to thank him for standing his ground. Vivian confessed that she had felt immense guilt for not being able to calm Leo herself, but seeing the boy thrive under Maeve's care had lifted a heavy weight from her shoulders. She agreed completely with Gideon's choices, stating that the health of the child was far more important than any old noble protocol. Gideon took her hand, grateful for her quiet support in changing the family's future. From that night forward, the atmosphere inside the old mansion began to shift in ways that no one could have anticipated. The silent, dusty corners of the second floor were now filled with the light footsteps of a young girl playing with her toys. Maeve settled into her role as nanny with a grace that seemed to influence the entire household, bringing a natural rhythm to their daily lives. Gideon found himself spending more time at home, drawn to the sound of laughter that now echoed through the grand rooms. The cold stone estate was slowly transforming into a sanctuary, protected by the quiet devotion of a human woman and the steady resolve of a king. As the weeks turned into months, the grand estate in Asheville became a place of unexpected warmth and lively energy. Lily spent her afternoons running through the wide corridors, her cheerful laughter breathing life into the old stone walls that had been silent for decades. Leo grew quickly, his bright eyes following Lily wherever she went, treating her like the older sister he had never expected to have. Maeve managed the children with an easy, natural balance, ensuring that both the human girl and the young vampire boy received the same dedicated affection. Gideon watched this daily harmony unfold, finding himself looking for any excuse to leave his study just to be near them. He began to look forward to the quiet evenings after the children had fallen asleep, when the mansion grew still under the mountain stars. Maeve would often sit in the small library on the second floor, reading by the warm light of a single lamp to wind down after a long day. Gideon would join her, bringing 2 cups of warm tea, and they would talk for hours about their pasts, their dreams, and the simple details of the children's progress. Through these quiet midnight conversations, a deep and mystical romance began to bloom between the human woman and the white-haired king. It was a love built on mutual respect and shared quiet moments, far removed from the loud expectations of the outside world. However, the outside world eventually found its way back to the estate during the celebration of Leo's 6-month milestone. Gideon had invited his extended family for a formal afternoon gathering, hoping they would see how well the boy was thriving and accept the changes. The large parlor was filled with elegant vampire relatives, their sharp eyes taking in the expensive decorations while murmuring among themselves about the human presence in the house. Gideon's aunt, Beatrice, a wealthy woman with a sharp tongue, pulled Gideon aside near the large glass doors, her voice dripping with a false sense of concern. She whispered that people were talking about the inappropriate level of intimacy he was granting to a simple worker. Beatrice insisted that Maeve was merely an employee and should not be sitting among the guests or participating in a family celebration. She argued that allowing a human such status within the household was unhealthy and blurred the necessary boundaries between their kinds. Gideon looked down at his aunt, his pale skin appearing exceptionally stark against his dark suit, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened to her complaints. He replied coldly that Maeve took care of his son better than anyone else ever could, and she was present because he personally wished her to be there. He added that if anyone felt uncomfortable with her presence, they were entirely free to leave his home immediately. He did not give Beatrice a chance to respond, turning his back on her and walking straight toward the sofa where Maeve was sitting. Maeve held Lily on her lap while gently rocking Leo in her arms, both children looking at the large celebration cake with wide, bright eyes. Gideon sat down directly beside her, his long white hair brushing against his shoulder as he offered her a warm, reassuring smile. Maeve looked at him softly, having noticed the tension across the room, but Gideon silently shook his head, telling her to ignore the foolish words of others. She smiled back, her calm brown eyes conveying a steady strength that showed she was entirely unaffected by the judgment around her. Gideon stood up a few moments later, tapping his glass with a small silver spoon to draw the attention of everyone in the crowded parlor. As the room fell into a heavy, expectant silence, he looked around at his relatives and spoke clearly so that every person could hear his words. He thanked them for coming to celebrate his son, but stated that he wanted to make an important announcement regarding the structure of his household. He pointed to Maeve, declaring that she was not merely a nanny, but the person who had saved the peace and stability of his family when everyone else had failed. He announced that she and her daughter were permanent members of this home, and that reality would never change. A heavy, stunned silence blanketed the room as his relatives stared in complete shock, unable to comprehend a vampire king elevating a human worker to such a position. Gideon felt no regret for his words, watching his mother and aunt exchange looks of pure outrage before turning away to hide their displeasure. He looked back down at Maeve and saw a few silent tears of relief tracking down her soft cheeks as she squeezed Lily closer to her chest. Vivian then stood up from her seat across the room, walking over to join Gideon and placing a supportive hand on his arm, showing the family that they stood completely united. Slowly, the tension in the parlor began to ease as some of the older, wiser relatives realized that the child's vibrant health was proof of Maeve's incredible value. The gathering continued, but the dynamic had shifted permanently, establishing Maeve's rightful place within the grand estate once and for all. As the guests began to depart later that evening, Gideon walked through the quiet gardens with Maeve, the cool night air refreshing after the crowded party. He knew that their journey together would continue to face resistance from the old world, but looking at Maeve's peaceful face, he felt an unshakable certainty about their future. Together, they had created a true sanctuary built on love, breaking the rigid chains of old tradition. 3 years passed like a gentle breeze through the mountains, bringing a deep sense of stability and happiness to the Asheville estate. Leo had grown into a healthy, energetic young boy who loved playing in the gardens, his laughter always accompanied by Lily's bright voice. The bond between Gideon and Maeve had deepened into a quiet, powerful love that required very few words to be understood by those around them. They spent their days working together to ensure the children had a balanced upbringing, blending the best of human warmth with the strength of vampire tradition. Gideon felt completely transformed, his old coldness entirely replaced by the genuine joy of the family life they had built together. One rainy afternoon, while sitting in the study watching the water stream down the glass windows, Gideon turned to Maeve with a brand new idea that had been forming in his mind. He explained that they had been incredibly fortunate to find a way to balance their lives. But many families in the surrounding city were struggling to find proper care for their children. He proposed opening a unique childcare center in the heart of Asheville, a place where both human and vampire children could be cared for with the same love and dedication Maeve provided. He told her that he wanted her to be his official business partner, taking full responsibility for designing the program and training the staff. Maeve stared at him with wide, shocked eyes, her hands freezing over the children's clothes she had been neatly folding into a wooden basket. She admitted that she had never imagined managing such a large project, having spent most of her life working hard just to earn a simple living. Gideon reached across the table, covering her warm hand with his pale fingers, assuring her that her natural wisdom and maternal instinct were far more valuable than any business degree. He explained that it made no sense to keep her incredible talents hidden within the walls of their estate when so many other families desperately needed that exact kind of healing care. Tears of pure joy and accomplishment filled Maeve's eyes as she listened to his encouraging words, realizing that he truly believed in her abilities as an equal partner. She accepted his proposal with a radiant smile, stating that she would love nothing more than to create a safe haven for children who felt lost or misunderstood. Over the next 6 months, the project quickly moved from a simple conversation to a physical reality as they purchased a beautiful, spacious building with a large backyard. Gideon handled the financial investments and legal permits, while Maeve spent every afternoon selecting soft furniture, educational toys, and hiring a compassionate team of caregivers. However, a significant problem arose just a few weeks before the grand opening of the center, threatening to disrupt their vision for the project. Gideon sat at his desk reviewing the final budget sheets, realizing that the high cost of maintaining a top-quality facility meant they would have to charge expensive monthly fees. He showed the numbers to Maeve, explaining that if they kept these prices, the low-income human families who lived in the working-class neighborhoods would never be able to afford their services. Maeve looked at the papers with a sad, heavy heart, refusing to allow their center to become an exclusive club for the wealthy elite. That evening during dinner, Vivian listened to their worries as she watched Leo and Lily happily sharing their food at the end of the long wooden table. Vivian set her fork down, offering a brilliant suggestion that she had seen used in some of the older charitable estates across Europe. She proposed establishing a flexible, sliding-scale payment system where every family would contribute exactly according to their monthly income. She explained that the wealthy vampire families and affluent human residents would pay a higher fee, which would directly subsidize the costs for the families who had very little to give. Gideon and Maeve looked at each other, instantly realizing that this was the perfect solution to their dilemma. The following week, Gideon organized a large meeting with the local parents to present the new payment structure and explain the core philosophy of the center. He was quite anxious about how the wealthier families would react to paying more. But the response was completely the opposite of what he had feared. The majority of the affluent parents accepted the proposal immediately, with several business owners even offering extra donations to help purchase additional playground equipment. They explained that they had already seen the wonderful impact Maeve had on the community, and they wanted to ensure that every child in Asheville had the same opportunity to thrive. This incredible moment of community support brought a deep sense of clarity to Gideon, proving that genuine kindness still existed in the world when people were given a chance to help. The center opened its doors the following Monday, and within a month, it was completely filled with the cheerful sounds of children playing together without any regard for wealth or status. Maeve moved through the rooms with a proud, happy smile, supervising the staff and greeting every parent with her signature warmth. Gideon stood by the entrance, watching her interact with a young human mother, feeling an immense pride that their shared love had created something so beautiful for the world. The childcare center quickly became a massive success throughout the region, earning a reputation as a peaceful sanctuary where every child was treated with deep respect. Maeve spent her mornings training the new teachers, demonstrating how to use quiet singing and gentle rocking to soothe anxious toddlers who were away from their parents for the first time. Gideon visited the facility every single afternoon, delighted to see how naturally the human and vampire children integrated, playing together in the sunshine without any division. The project had brought a deep fulfillment to his life, cementing his romantic bond with Maeve as they worked side by side toward a shared beautiful purpose. One Tuesday afternoon, a young human woman rushed through the front doors of the center, her face pale and her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She held the hand of a small 3-year-old boy who looked equally frightened by his mother's obvious distress. The woman explained to the receptionist that she had just been called for an emergency job interview after months of unemployment. But her babysitter had canceled at the last minute. The receptionist began to explain that all their classrooms were currently at full capacity. But Maeve stepped forward before the worker could finish her sentence. Maeve placed a comforting hand on the mother's trembling shoulder, telling her in a calm, steady voice to leave her son at the center and go to her interview without any worry. The mother looked at Maeve with a mixture of disbelief and intense gratitude, tears welling in her eyes, as she realized she would not have to miss this life-changing opportunity. She knelt down, gave her son a tight hug, and whispered that she would return very soon before rushing out the door to catch her bus. Maeve immediately turned her attention to the little boy, kneeling down to his level and introducing him to Leo and Lily, who were playing nearby. Gideon watched from the hallway as Maeve effortlessly guided the frightened child into a game of building blocks, making him feel completely safe within a matter of minutes. He walked over to her, his pale face softened by a gentle smile, as he remarked that she never failed to amaze him with her endless compassion. Maeve looked up at him, her brown eyes shining as she replied that helping a desperate mother was exactly why they had built this place in the first place. The young mother returned late that evening, her face radiant with a bright smile as she announced that she had successfully landed the job. She broke down in tears of pure relief when Maeve informed her that her son's care for the week had already been taken care of by their community fund. However, the smooth rhythm of their lives was unexpectedly disrupted a few weeks later when Maeve received a late-night phone call that left her visibly shaken. Gideon found her sitting on the edge of the library sofa, holding the phone against her chest, with tears streaming down her face. She explained that her mother had been rushed to the hospital in her hometown after suffering a sudden, severe illness. The doctors had stated that her mother would require constant care and assistance during a long recovery period that could last for several months. Maeve's voice broke as she admitted that she was the only one who could travel back to manage the situation, meaning she would have to leave Asheville immediately. Gideon sat down beside her, wrapping his long arms around her trembling frame and holding her close against his chest to offer his steady support. He told her firmly that she did not need to apologize or worry about the center, as family always came first regardless of the circumstances. He assured her that he and Vivian would manage the daily operations of the facility, and that Lily would stay at the estate with them where she would be cared for like their own daughter. Maeve leaned into his embrace, letting out a long sob of relief, deeply grateful that she did not have to face this difficult family crisis alone. Maeve departed on the early morning train the following Monday, leaving a strange, heavy emptiness behind in the large rooms of the Asheville estate. Lily spent the first few days sitting quietly by the large windows, missing her mother with a quiet sadness that broke Gideon's heart every time he walked past. Vivian took it upon herself to spend hours playing board games and baking sweet treats with the young girl, doing everything possible to fill the void left by Maeve's absence. Gideon stayed in constant contact with Maeve, calling her every evening to listen to her updates and offer whatever emotional comfort his cold vampire voice could provide. Through those long, solitary months, the childcare center continued to run flawlessly, proving that the staff had been trained exceptionally well by Maeve's diligent efforts. Every system she had put in place remained strong, allowing the children to thrive even while their beloved director was away caring for her own mother. Gideon managed the finances and handled the daily parental meetings, gaining a much deeper appreciation for the immense amount of hard work Maeve put into the project every day. He counted the days until her return, realizing with a complete certainty that his heart belonged entirely to the human woman who had brought light into his dark world. 3 long months passed before the welcome news finally arrived that Maeve's mother had made a full recovery and was now able to walk independently. Maeve called Gideon on a crisp Friday evening, her voice filled with a familiar lightness, as she announced that her sister had agreed to take over the daily care duties, allowing her to return home to Asheville. The entire estate went into a flurry of joyful preparation, with Leo and Lily spending the afternoon baking a large welcome-back cake with Vivian in the kitchen. Gideon stood by the front gates as the afternoon train schedule neared, his pale skin catching the golden light of the setting sun as he waited. When the taxi finally pulled up the gravel driveway, Lily broke away from the group, running as fast as her small legs could carry her toward her mother. Maeve stepped out of the car, looking a bit thinner and visibly tired from the long months of caregiving, but her eyes shone with an incredible happiness as she lifted her daughter into a tight embrace. Leo followed close behind, throwing his arms around Maeve's waist and welcoming her back with the pure enthusiasm of an 8-year-old boy. Gideon walked forward slowly, his white hair catching the mountain breeze, and stopped right in front of her, his gaze holding a deep, unspoken devotion. He reached out, gently taking her hand and drawing her into a quiet, warm embrace that seemed to melt away all the stress and separation of the past 3 months. He whispered that the house had been entirely incomplete without her presence, and that he was deeply happy to have his family whole once again. Maeve, leaning her head against his shoulder for a brief moment, letting out a long breath of pure contentment as she replied that she had missed them more than words could say. They walked back toward the mansion together, the children chatting excitedly about everything that had happened during her absence, restoring the beautiful harmony that had been missing for so long. The next morning, Maeve returned to the child care center, greeted by loud cheers and handmade cards from the staff and the children who had missed her deeply. She settled back into her routine with her usual grace, bringing an immediate sense of calm and structure to the bustling classrooms. Gideon spent the afternoon observing her from the office window, feeling an overwhelming gratitude for the day she had stepped into his nursery years ago. He realized that the deep love he felt for her was not just about romance, but about a shared understanding of what it truly meant to protect and nurture the people around them. A few weeks after her return, an incident occurred at the center's playground that demonstrated just how much the children had absorbed the values of their parents. Gideon was walking through the courtyard when he heard raised voices near the wooden swings, where a group of older human and vampire boys were gathered. He stopped behind a large oak tree, deciding to observe how the situation would unfold without intervening immediately. He saw a young human girl sitting on the grass, crying silently because her simple canvas lunchbox was torn, and the other boys were mocking her for not having a new one. Before any teacher could step in, young Leo walked straight into the center of the group, his posture firm as he looked at the older boys with a steady, unblinking gaze that resembled his father's royal presence. He told them in a loud, clear voice to stop teasing her immediately, stating that a lunchbox had absolutely nothing to do with a person's worth. Leo then knelt down on the grass beside the crying girl, using his clean handkerchief to gently wipe away her tears before opening his own backpack. He offered her exactly half of his turkey sandwich, telling her that they could easily share his lunch and use his backpack together for the rest of the school term. The group of boys stood in silence, looking thoroughly ashamed of their unkind behavior, before quietly turning away to leave the 2 children alone on the grass. Gideon felt a sharp sting of proud tears behind his eyes as he watched his young son demonstrate such deep empathy and courage at such a young age. That evening during dinner, Gideon proudly shared the entire story with Maeve and Vivian, praising Leo for his actions at the playground. Maeve looked at the young boy with a beautiful, proud smile, her eyes warm as she explained that children simply learned from the actions of the adults they watched every single day. She looked across the table at Gideon, reminding him that Leo had grown up watching his father defend those who had less, and opening doors for families who needed help. Vivian agreed completely, noting that the beautiful environment they had created at the center was shaping a brand new generation of compassionate human and vampire citizens. Gideon reached across the table, taking Maeve's hand in his own, feeling a deep peace settle over his heart as he looked toward the future. They had successfully built a true legacy of kindness in Asheville, proving that love could dismantle even the oldest and most rigid prejudices of the immortal world. The years continued to pass in a steady stream of shared victories and quiet happiness as the child care network expanded throughout the state of North Carolina. By the time Leo celebrated his 10th birthday, the small center had grown into 3 thriving facilities, providing high-quality care to over 200 human and vampire families. Maeve served as the educational director for all 3 locations, supervising 50 dedicated staff members who shared her core philosophy of compassionate, intuitive care. Lily had grown into a brilliant teenager who spent her weekends volunteering at the centers, proudly telling everyone that she wanted to follow exactly in her mother's footsteps when she grew up. One morning, a group of wealthy corporate investors from New York arrived at the Asheville estate, offering a large sum of money to purchase the entire child care network. They presented a detailed plan to replicate the centers across the entire country, transforming their unique community model into a highly profitable national franchise. Gideon listened to their presentation in the study, looking at the large figures on the paperwork and realizing that the money would secure his family's financial legacy for generations. After the investors left to allow them time to deliberate, Gideon called a family meeting in the living room to discuss the massive offer with Maeve and Vivian. Vivian was the first to speak, stating firmly that selling the network would mean losing complete control over how the children were cared for on a daily basis. She argued that a large corporation would inevitably prioritize corporate profits over the well-being of poor families, destroying the sliding-scale payment system they had worked so hard to establish. Maeve agreed completely, adding that their centers were built on personal relationships, trust, and love, qualities that could never be properly replicated by a distant corporate board of directors. Gideon smiled, feeling a deep pride in their shared conviction, as he agreed that their true purpose was far more valuable than any amount of money. The next morning, Gideon met with the corporate investors and firmly declined their generous offer, stating that his business was not for sale at any price. The investors tried to insist, offering an even larger sum of money, but Gideon remained completely firm, politely showing them to the door with an absolute finality. As he closed the heavy wooden doors behind them, he felt a deep sense of relief and peace, knowing that they had successfully protected the sacred mission they had started years ago. He walked back into the garden, where Maeve was helping Leo organize a collection drive for underprivileged human children, her face lit up by the warm morning sun. Leo had personally requested this charity drive instead of receiving birthday gifts for his 10th milestone, stating that he already had everything he could ever need within his home. Gideon watched his son hand a beautifully wrapped teddy bear to a young human child, his heart swelling with an overwhelming gratitude for the wonderful person his son had become. He knew that Leo's beautiful character was the direct result of growing up surrounded by Maeve's unconditional love and steady, compassionate guidance. He realized that the simple human cleaner who had walked into his nursery 15 years ago had completely transformed his entire existence, turning a cold vampire palace into a true, loving home. Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep and the large mansion grew quiet under the starry sky, Gideon gathered everyone in the formal drawing room for a special announcement. He stood before Maeve, his pale skin appearing soft in the warm glow of the fireplace, his white hair neatly brushed back as he took her hands in his own. He presented her with a legal document that officially granted her 50% ownership of all his family estates, businesses, and financial assets, making her his permanent partner in every single aspect of life. He looked directly into her beautiful brown eyes, his voice thick with an honest emotion, as he thanked her for everything she had given them. He told her that she had completely changed his life and the lives of hundreds of families across the city, bringing a deep healing that wealth could never buy. He stated that he wanted to ensure that she and Lily were fully protected and recognized as his rightful family for the rest of eternity. regardless of what the old vampire society might say. Maeve broke down into tears of pure joy, overwhelmed by the grand gesture of love and recognition after so many years of quiet dedication and hard work. Gideon wrapped his arms around her, drawing her close as Vivian, Leo, and Lily joined them in a tight, collective family embrace that symbolized the incredible journey they had shared. As I sit by the tall glass windows of the study, watching the gentle silver moonlight paint the dark outlines of the Asheville Mountains, I find my thoughts drifting naturally toward the quiet path we have walked together over the past 15 years. The cold, silent corridors that once defined my immortal existence have been permanently replaced by the enduring warmth of a real home, anchored by the beautiful human soul sleeping peacefully down the hall. I look out at the dark horizon and realize that the true value of an endless life is not found in royal titles, vast fortunes, or old traditions, but in the simple choice to open one's heart to the power of love and compassion. We have built something that will outlast the old prejudices of our world. A quiet sanctuary where every child is seen, every mother is supported, and every soul is allowed to find its true place of belonging. The future no longer feels like a long, repetitive stretch of cold centuries, but rather a beautiful, unfolding landscape filled with the bright promise of shared laughter, quiet evening conversations, and the steady, unbreakable bond of a family we chose to create from the very depths of our hearts.